around me had their flotation devices. They'd pulled up their seat bottoms, or they had a life jacket that they'd taken. I had nothing with me.
Skiles heads back to help the crew in the cabin get passengers out of the sinking plane. He knows there's not much time, and one of the flight attendants has been injured.
I went back to about mid-cabin, and Sully and I and two young men were getting seat cushions and life vests, which are underneath the seats, and we're passing them out.
And I'm looking around trying to assess the situation. Is the plane going to blow up? What's the next step? Yeah, there were actually probably 6 or 8 people that went into the water. And they were shivering and they were cold. We started pulling them back up onto the wing.
At the back of the plane, water continues pouring in. Passengers are directed to move forward to escape.
Go over the seats if you have to.
This unwieldy boat won't be floating much longer.
We were actually in the water, up to our knees, and it was just absolutely freezing cold. Every part of your body that was in that water just ached to the bone.
Come forward! Is there anybody here?
We were very confident there was nobody left on the airplane, but what was going on the wings, we just had no idea.
Skiles and Sullenberger are the last ones off the plane.
I just saw the big splash when the plane just bounced over the water.
A small commercial airline crashed into the water.
They've been in the water more than 10 minutes already.
LaGuardia Airport has sent out an alert to New York's emergency services. In the middle of the Hudson, 155 frozen people hope that help will arrive in time.
I saw the first ferry, and I could see the wheelhouse. I felt like, okay, we're really going to be okay. There was a sigh of relief.
First on the scene are passenger ferries that have been shuttling people across the Hudson. They are eventually joined by the Coast Guard and fire department.
The atmosphere on the ferry was still one of concern because we didn't know whether all the passengers got off the plane at that point in time.
I was sitting in the union office preparing to make my statement.
Where do I start?
And that's when one of my friends popped their head into the office and said, "Hey, Patty, it looks like everyone made it." And I was like, "Really?" That was incredible news. I mean, I was still traumatized by the event itself, but the fact that everyone made it was just, it's like the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders.
The entire nation looks on as every single passenger and the entire crew of Flight 1549 is brought to safety.
It's cold! Are you okay?
Like so many others around the world, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board are riveted to the pictures.
Hey, you gotta see this.
We learned a little bit about the accident, of course, before we launched. The TV channels were showing the aircraft in the river and everything.
All agree that the landing is extraordinary.
I think it was a miracle, and very blessed to have walked away.
I reached over to Captain Sully and just said, "I just want you to know you saved my life and everyone's lives here."
In my mind, we were dead, and every one of us came out of that alive. It's a miracle.
By evening, the plane is almost completely underwater. The current is pushing it towards the edge of the river.
The aircraft was tied up against the pier, and we went down to look at it to see what we were up against, of course. But we can't do much at night.
NTSB investigator Harold Reichel arrives on the scene.
The water was dark, of course. We just saw the tail and most of the fuselage, and one of the wings was underneath the water.
We knew it was going to be quite difficult to get it, A, out of the water, and then B, to a place where we could examine the components of the airplane in a more controlled manner.
For investigators, it's an unusual situation. Normally, their main task is to uncover the cause of a crash. With Flight 1549, the cause seems obvious.
Birds.
The original Mayday call was clear.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Cactus 1549. Hit birds, we've lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back towards LaGuardia. Okay, you need to come back.
The crew reported that they hit several birds shortly after takeoff.
I think everybody realized that a bird strike had occurred. What people didn't know was what kind of birds brought the aircraft down, whether it might have been a combination of a bird strike plus something else, whether the crew acted and flew the aircraft as they should have.
My aircraft.
Your aircraft.
Get the QRH.
U.S. Airways pilot made an incredibly skillful emergency landing in the Hudson River.
Investigators want to interview both pilots, but their sudden fame makes them hard to get to.
It became a little bit more difficult than usual to A, locate the flight crew, and then B, to talk to them. They were instant heroes.
Nothing in life can prepare one for the media frenzy of a situation, like this.
And it's not just the pilot's newfound celebrity that's an obstacle for investigators like Catherine Wilson.
One of the most challenging things in this case was nobody wanted to sully Sully. He was a hero in this case, and we were the ones who was potentially going to pick apart what he did and try to find out what he did and whether it was right or not.
To prove that birds caused the crash, authorities need to get the plane out of the water. But a vital piece is missing.
We've been told earlier that both engines were still attached to the aircraft. That turned out not to be true. So that became a major goal right off the bat, was to figure out where that second engine was. We didn't know exactly where it was.
Let's focus on this area.
But we had films of the aircraft actually touching down, and we could cross-reference different things. We used some side-scanning sonar that gave us a very clear picture of the bottom.
It wasn't that easy to do because the Hudson River has a current, and the current changes throughout the day. So it took 3 days, ultimately, to find the engine.
Within days, the recovered engine and the rest of the aircraft are moved to a warehouse in New Jersey, so investigators can study the wreckage more carefully.
We certainly couldn't do it out there at the edge of the Hudson River, and you can imagine how interesting it was to take an airplane 150 or 200 feet long through a very, very populated area in New Jersey.
As the plane is being moved, investigators work with the voice and data recorders.
Okay, let's hear it.
Which were in the most damaged part of the plane, the tail.
The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder were in virtually pristine shape. The aircraft had sustained quite a bit of damage in the rear end, but the recorders themselves survived very well.
We were really lucky. All of the data was able to be downloaded normally.
We got one roll, both of them rolling back.
Listening to the CVR provides vital insight into how the crew responded to the emergency.
In this case, both Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles acted extremely professionally.
Ignition start.
Each member had their own roles and responsibilities. They stayed with those roles and responsibilities throughout the accident flight and communicated only when necessary.
Put the flaps up.
On Flight 1549,
My aircraft.
it took just seconds for the crew to each assume their individual responsibilities. Part of the reason they handled the emergency so well was that Jeffrey Skiles had only just finished his Airbus training.
This was my first trip out as a regular line pilot in the Airbus A320. I literally was right out of training.
And the benefit of that was that he knew exactly the checklist to turn to, and that's exactly what he did.
If you're remaining, engine mode selector, ignition.
Crews are highly trained in emergency procedures, and the main thing is to follow procedures in this instance, and that's exactly what First Officer Skiles did by grabbing the quick reference handbook and turning to the appropriate checklist.
But as investigators examine the checklist for restarting this plane's engines, they make a troubling discovery.
It was assembled for an event that occurred 20,000 feet in the air, where a crew would have plenty of time to slowly and carefully go through a 3-page checklist, the end of which was, how do we ditch the airplane?
So it was a 3-page checklist, and really, I only got to about the page and a half through this checklist in the time that we had.
Airspeed optimum relay.
And the crew spent a lot of time trying to restart the engines when they could have been focusing on preparing the airplane for the ditching.
300 knots. You don't have that.
We don't.
Overly complicated checklists have played a role in deadly plane crashes in the past. In 1998, a fire broke out on board a Swissair passenger jet. The checklist the crew used for that situation would have taken them up to half an hour to complete. It's a half hour they didn't have. But on Flight 1549, the checklist was far from the greatest challenge facing Sullenberger and Skiles.
I'm not sure we can make any runway.
Water landings are notoriously difficult because unless they're perfect, they can be catastrophic. In 1996, after a hijacking, an Ethiopian Airlines captain tried to land off the Comoros Islands when his plane ran out of fuel. His left wing hit the water first, causing the plane to cartwheel. It was ripped to pieces. Of the 175 people on board, only 50 survived. Investigators soon learn that none of the major airlines use simulators to teach pilots how to land on water.
Training for ditching in a simulator is very difficult. We don't have the models to accurately simulate what an airplane would do when it touches down on water. Given the rarity of this type of event, it would be very difficult to justify training pilots for this type of event.
But even without ever going through a simulation, Captain Sullenberger got almost everything right. He kept the nose up and wings level. He let the tail hit the water first, slowing the jet down enough so that it survived the impact.
Nice flying.
NTSB investigators turned to their own simulation to answer a vital question.
This is the captain.
Did Sullenberger have to land in the Hudson?
Brace for impact.
Or could he have made it to a runway?
Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cactus 1549. Hit birds.
Investigators studied Chesley Sullenberger and Jeffrey Skiles' actions in the moments after their plane collided with birds.
Ignition.
We wanted to know, did the pilots do the right thing? So what we did in the simulator was we tested exactly that. Was there enough energy to make it back to LaGuardia? And what we found was that about 50% of the time we were able to make it back to the airport.
But when a 35-second delay is imposed after the bird strike to account for the crew's attempt to restart the engines, all of the simulator pilots crash before reaching the runway.
When we took into consideration the decision-making process that Captain Sullenberger went through, we realized that it was not possible to make it back to the airport.
Cactus 1549, runway 4 is available.
There's no doubt.
We're going to be in the Hudson.
Putting the plane in the Hudson was the right call. Sullenberger didn't have enough altitude to glide to either LaGuardia or Teterboro airports.
Got one roll. Both of them rolling back.
The investigators also discover that Sullenberger made a decision that wasn't at the top of the checklist, one that was critical to the survival of everyone on board.
I'm starting the APU.
On commercial jetliners, the engines provide power to electrical systems. If the engines stop working, the crew eventually loses those systems. The APU is an emergency generator that keeps some things running.
The APU allowed him to still see his screens, the instruments still worked.
It also allowed the A320 itself to assist with the heroic landing. The APU provided power to the plane's electronic brain, stopping the pilots from making any potentially dangerous moves. It kept them inside a so-called flight envelope.
By starting the APU early in the sequence, the flight crew was able to maintain the flight envelope protections, which prevented the airplane from stalling when the airspeed got too slow.
It's right on the edge of stall speed.
The flight data shows that Sullenberger was going slower than the ideal speed.
The airspeed during the accident sequence got about 20 knots slower than it should have been for this flight.
But the A320's flight computer is designed to constantly adjust the plane's pitch and keep it